Welcome to my garden. GinGeeGoodEarth, your host, Gretchen Schmitt. We're going to go ahead and read as much as we can on a continuation of the universal history of the United States of America. And it's an earlier period of discoveries down to the present time, giving a description of the western country, its soil, settlements, its increase of population history. And again, it's written by C.B. Taylor. And I want to go ahead and start on page, let's see, 50. Yeah, we're going to start on page 51 at the bottom. And we did finish up on page 52. But welcome to my garden. Enjoy the picture show that I have. And I want to show this picture again. And this is a picture of a first American. And I put this picture together with the arrow point. And the gentleman's arms are up in the air, and that means a full life, success, and peace. And he's not slumped in the horse. That represents defeat. This picture illustrates success and a win in life. Okay. And I think I said $30. If you look at all the other videos, you'll be able to see the cost of different antiques that I present. It's just simple. I'm not selling that many items. Right now I have 3 things for sale in the previous videos, but I encourage you to watch the very first video. It goes over my objectives. I only have maybe 20 minutes on each video because I have very inexpensive equipment. This picture of me teaching at the Ice House in Phoenix, and I direct the Pittsburgh Victorian and Gibson girls, and I want us to have fun. And there you go, New York City. So we're going to start on the bottom of page 51, and let me get going. Hopefully we're going to read the Ike's Farewell to Churchill, that, in other words, General Dwight Eisenhower is saying farewell to Churchill, and his death was January 30th, 1965. The enemy were now seized with astonishment, and forced by the flames from the lurking places into open light, became fair mark for the English soldiers. Some climbed to the palisades, and were instantly brought down by the fire of the English muskets. Others, desperately sailing forth from their burning cells, were shot or cut in pieces with the sword. Such terror fell upon them that they would run back from the English into the very flames. Great numbers perished in the conflagration. The greatness and violence of the fire, the reflection of the light, the flashing and roar of the arms, the shrieks and yellings of the men, women, and children in the fort, and the shoutings of the Indians without, just at the dawning of the morning, exhibited a grand and awful scene. In a little more than an hour, the whole work of destruction was finished. 70 wigwams were burnt, and 500 or 600 Indians perished, either by the sword or in the flames. 150 warriors had been sent on the evening before, who that very early morning were to have gone forth against the English. Of these and all who belonged to the fort, 7 only escaped, and 7 were made prisoners. It had been previously concluded not to burn the fort, but to destroy the enemy and take the plunder, but the captain afterwards found it the only expedient to obtain the victory and save his men. Thus parents and children, the Sannup and squaw, the old man and babe perished in promiscuous ruin. Though the victory was complete, yet the army were in great danger and distress. The men had been exceedingly fatigued by the heat and long marches through rough and difficult places, and by that constant watch and guard which they had been obliged to keep. They had now been greatly exhausted by the sharpness of this action and the excursions with which had been necessitated to make. Their loss was very considerable. 2 men were killed and nearly 20 wounded. This was more than 1/4 of the English. Numbers fainted by reason of fatigue, the heat, and want of necessities. Their surgeon, their provisions, and the articles necessary for the wounded were on board the vessels which had been ordered to sail from Narragansett Bay the night before, for the Pequot harbor, but there was no appearance of them in the Sound. They were sensible that, by the burning of the fort and the noise of the war, they had alarmed the country, and therefore were in constant expectation of an attack by a fresh and numerous enemy from the other fortress, and from every quarter whence the Pequots might be collected. A number of friendly Indians had been wounded, and they were so distracted with fear that it was difficult even to speak with their guide, an interpreter, or to know anything what they designed. The English were in an enemy's country, and entire strangers to the way in which they must return. The enemy were far more numerous than themselves, and enraged to the highest degree. Another circumstance rendered their situation still more dangerous. Their provisions and ammunition were nearly expended. 4 or 5 men were so wounded that it was necessary to carry them, and they were also obliged to hear about 20 firearms, so that not more than 40 men could be spared for action. After an interval of about an hour, while the officers were in consultation what course they should take, their vessels, as though guided by the hand of Providence, to severe the necessities of these brave men, come full in view and under a fair gale, were steering directly into the harbor. This is the situation of the army at that time, was a most joyful sight. Immediately upon the discovery of the vessels, about 300 Indians came on from the other fort. Captain Mason, perceiving their approach, led out a chosen party to engage them, and try their temper. He gave them such a warm reception as soon checked and put them to a stand. This gave him great encouragement, and he ordered the army to march from Pequot harbor. The enemy upon us immediately advanced to the hill where the fort stood, and viewing the destruction which had been made, stamped, they tore their hair from their heads. So they stomped, and they tore the hair from their heads. They were upset. After a short pause, the blowing themselves up to the highest transport of passion, they leaped down the hill after the army, and in the most violent manner, as though they were about to run over the English. Captain Underhill, who, with a number of the best men, was ordered to defend the rear, soon checked the eagerness of their pursuit, and taught them to keep at more respectful distance. The friendly Indians, who had not deserted, now kept close to the English, and it was believed that after the enemy came on, they were afraid to leave them. The enemy pursued the army nearly 6 miles, sometimes shooting at a distance from behind the rocks and trees, and other times pressing on more violently and desperately hazarding themselves in the open field. That the English might be enabled to fight, Captain Mason soon hired the Indians to carry the wounded men in their arms. The English killed several of the enemy while they pursued them, but sustained no loss themselves. When they killed a Pequot, the other Indians would shout, "Run and fetch his head." At length the enemy, finding that they could make no impression upon the army, and that wounds and death attended their attempts, gave over the pursuit. The army then marched to the harbor, where their colors flying, and were received on board the vessels with great mutual joy and congratulation. In about 3 weeks from the time the men embarked at Hartford, they returned again to their respective habitations. They were received with the greatest exultation, as the people had been deeply affected with their danger, and full of anxiety for their friends, while nearly half the effective men in the colony were in service upon so hazardous an enterprise, so sudden a change, in the great victory obtained, and in the safe return of so many of their children and neighbors, filled with their exceeding joy and thankfulness. Every family and every worshiping assembly spoke the language of praise and thanksgiving. Several circumstances attended this enterprise, were much noticed by the soldiers themselves, and especially by all the pious people. It was considered a very providential that the army should march nearly 40 miles, and considerable part of it in the enemy's country, and not be discovered until the moment they were ready to commence the attack. It was judged remarkable that the vessels should come into the harbor at the very hour in which they were most needed. The life of Captain Mason was very signally preserved, as he entered a wigwam for fire to burn the fort. An Indian was drawing an arrow to the very head, and would have killed him instantly, but Davis, one of his sergeants, cut the bowstring with his cutlass, and prevented the fatal shot. Lieutenant Bull received an arrow into a hard piece of cheese which he had in his clothes, and by it was saved and harmless. 2 soldiers, John Dyer, Thomas Stiles, both servants of one man, were shot in the knots of their neckcloths, and by them preserved from instant death. Few enterprises have ever been achieved with more personal bravery or good conduct, and few instances have so great a proportion of the effective men of a whole colony, state, or nation been put to so great immediate danger, and few have a people been so deeply and immediately interested as the whole colony of Connecticut was in this time, in that uncommon crisis. In these respects, even the great armaments and battles of Europe are comparatively a little importance. In this, under the divine conduct by 77 brave men, Connecticut was saved, and the most warlike and terrible Indian nation in New England defeated and ruined. The body of the Pequots returning from the pursuit of Captain Mason, repaired to Success at the royal fortress and related the doleful story to their misfortunes. They charged them all to his haughtiness and misconduct, and threatened him and his with immediate destruction. His friends and chief counselors interceded for him, and at their entreaty his men spared his life. Then upon consultation they concluded that there could not, with safety, remain any longer in that country. They were indeed so panic-struck that, burning their wigwams and destroying their fort, they had fled and scattered into various parts of the country. Sassakis, Mononoto, and Severity, 80 of their chief counselors and warriors, took their route toward the Hudson River. Just before Captain Mason went out upon the expedition against the Pequots, the Dutch performed a very neighborly office for Connecticut. The two maids who had been captivated at Withersfield had, through the humanity and meditation of Mononoto's squaw, been spared from death and killed and kindly treated. The Dutch governor, receiving intelligence of their circumstances, determined to redeem them at any time. Determined to return them at any rate, and dispatched a sloop to Pequot harbor for that purpose. Upon its arrival, the Dutch made large offers for their redemption, but the Pequots would not accept them. Finally, as the Dutch had a number of Pequots on board whom they had taken, and finding that they could do no better, they offered the Pequots 6 of their own men for the 2 maids. These they accepted, and the Dutch delivered the young woman to Saybrook. Just before Captain Mason and his party arrived, of them he received particular information respecting the enemy. An Indian rumor dispatched by Mr. Williams of Providence soon carried the news of the success of Connecticut against the Pequots to the governor of Massachusetts. The governor and his council, judging that the Pequots had received a capital blow, sent forward but 120 men. These were commanded by Mr. Stoughton, and the Reverend Mr. Wilson of Boston was sent as his chaplain. This party arrived at Pequot Harbor the later part of June. By the assistance of the Narragansett Indians, the party under Captain Stoughton surrounded a large body of Pequots in a swamp. They took 80 captives. 30 were men, the rest were women and children. The men, except 2 Sachems, were killed, but the women and children were saved. The Sachems promised to conduct the English to the Sassakas, and for that purpose were spared for the present. The court of Connecticut ordered that 40 men should be raised forthwith for the further prosecution of the war against the Pequots, to be commanded by Captain Mason. The troops from Connecticut made a junction with the party under the command of Captain Stoughton at Pequot. Mr. Ludlow, with other principal gentlemen from Connecticut, went also with the army to advise with respect to the measures to be adopted in the further prosecution of the war. Upon the general's consultation, it was concluded to pursue the Pequots, who had fled to the westward mountains. The army marched immediately and soon discovered the places where the enemy had rendezvoused at their several removes. As they were not far distant from each other, it appeared that they moved slowly, having their women and children with them. They also were without provisions, and were obliged to dig for clams without provisions. They were obliged to dig for clams, and to range the groves for such articles as they afforded. The English found some scattering Pequots as they scoured the country, whom they captivated, and from whom they obtained an intelligence relative to the Pequots whom they were pursuing, but finding that the Sachems they had spared would give them no information, they had beheaded them on their march at the place called Men-un-Contuck, since Guilford, from the circumstance, the spot of which the execution was done, bears the name of Sachem's Head to the present time. In 3 days they arrived at New Haven Harbor. The vessels sailed along the river, while the troops marched by land. So we'll finish that up. It's page 57. And the next paragraph begins, at New Haven, then called Quinnipiac, a great smoke at a small distance they discovered in the woods. So we'll pick up there, and I want to go ahead and read Ike's Farewell to Churchill, General mourns my old friend. January 30th, 1965. Okay, I'm going to get a sip of iced coffee. Okay, I have never read the book, A Universal History of the United States of America, until I made the commitment that I would read through this book. Now this picture, Westmoreland County Veterans War on Terror, that is the Alley-Kiskey Valley Museum. You can see the 9/11 video on the picture show. And we had a big fundraiser for the new park that'll be completed September 11th, 2021, to mark 20 years that the United States of America has been at war, the longest war in the history of the Americas. And the park is called Patriots Day Plaza, War on Terror. And so I worked on that project to help market that and raise monies for the park. And it should be built and finished and celebrated September 11th, 2021. And everyone is welcome to join us. Tell your friends and neighbors, and of course the veterans. Okay, let's go ahead and I will do a dramatic read of Ike's Farewell to Churchill. I need one more. I need another sip of coffee. Ike's Farewell to Churchill. June 30th, 1965. General mourns my old friend. London, January 30th. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, twice President of the United States and wartime commander of the Allied armies in Europe, said his last farewell today to Sir Winston, my old friend. He had crossed the Atlantic a quarter of a century ago to lead the Allied expedition forces. This time he came to pay tribute to the man he said was Britain, a leader who always called him Ike. General Eisenhower spoke over the 2 radio and television networks of the British Broadcasting Corporation after the moving memorial service in St. Paul's Cathedral, and as Mr. Churchill's body was being borne to the grave. The BBC did not broadcast a picture of Mr. Eisenhower, but focused its cameras instead on the Thames River, where a barge was carrying the heir to Waterloo Station for the trip to Bladon and burial there. Upon the mighty Thames, great avenue of history, move at this moment to their final resting place the mortal remains of Sir Winston Churchill, he said. He was a great maker of history, but his work is done and the record is closed. He was far more concerned with the quality of the service he could render to his nation and to humanity. Though he had no fear of death, he coveted always the opportunity to continue with his service. Mr. Eisenhower then came to his final salute to his old comrade in arms. "At this moment," he said, "as our hearts stand to attention, we say an affectionate, though sad goodbye to the leader to whom the entire body of free men owes so much. In the coming years, countless words will strive to interpret the motive and describe exactly the virtue of Sir Winston Churchill. Leader, statesman, citizen, the two great countries were proud to claim him as their own. Of the many things so written and spoken, there will ring out through all the centuries one incontestable refrain. Here was a champion of freedom. May God grant that we and the generations who will remember him heed the lessons he taught us in his deeds, in his words, in his life. May we carry on his work until no nation lies in captivity, no man is denied opportunity for fulfillment. And now to you, Sir Winston, my old friend, farewell." Okay, this will wrap up the video for GinGeeGoodEarth. The date is June 6th, 2020. And I bid you a good day, and always carry a wonderful song in your heart, and enjoy the rest of the weekend, and we'll see you again on the book The Vikings will be my next reading. Okay, have a great day.